In the early 1980s, the BBC produced a science fiction serial about giant walking plants that kill people. And somehow, against all probability, it treated the material with almost complete seriousness. No camp irony, no exaggerated spectacle, no sense that the audience should laugh at the premise. Instead, The Day of the Triffids approached science fiction as sober television drama, and that decision shaped everything about the production. Today, the serial occupies an unusual place in British television memory. It is remembered partly as classic science fiction, partly as horror, partly as apocalyptic drama, and partly as one of those distinctly BBC productions which feels far larger in memory than its budget or technical limitations might suggest. But what makes the series interesting now is not simply the Triffids themselves. It is the way the BBC attempted to make the impossible feel believable. The original novel by John Wyndham had already helped define a specifically British style of science fiction: calm, observational, rooted in ordinary life, and far more interested in social behaviour than futuristic spectacle. Wyndham's catastrophe does not initially arrive through explosions or invading armies. Instead, civilization begins to collapse through blindness, confusion, isolation, and the slow breakdown of infrastructure people normally take for granted. That approach suited the BBC remarkably well, because British television drama during this period often relied less on spectacle than on credibility. The BBC could not compete with Hollywood in terms of visual scale or special effects, but it possessed something else: experience in producing serious studio drama grounded in recognisable human behaviour and familiar social environments. And The Day of the Triffid uses those strengths constantly. The serial spends enormous amounts of time on confusion, uncertainty, empty spaces, frightened conversations, hospitals, blocked roads, radio broadcasts, abandoned buildings, and ordinary people trying to understand what has happened around them. A man waking in hospital to discover most of the population blind, voices echoing through near empty streets, people stumbling helplessly through spaces that only days earlier felt ordinary and secure. The distant movement of Triffids emerging slowly through silence. The production understands that unease often becomes more frightening when it is restrained. The Triffids themselves are important, but the real horror often comes from social collapse becoming believable. That distinction matters because the production never treats science fiction as escapist fantasy detached from ordinary reality. Instead, the impossible invades recognisable Britain. Hospitals feel like real hospitals. Cities feel inhabited. The survivors behave with fear, exhaustion, selfishness, courage, and confusion rather than heroic certainty. Even the visual style contributes to that realism. Like many BBC productions of the era, the series combines location filming with studio videotape work. Modern viewers sometimes notice the technical differences immediately: film for exterior realism, videotape for interior studio scenes. And because the production sits at the beginning of the 1980s, while still carrying much of the visual and dramatic culture of 1970s BBC television, the serial now occupies an interesting transitional space in British broadcasting history. The production does not attempt cinematic illusion in the Hollywood sense. Instead, it creates something closer to theatrical realism: performance, atmosphere, dialogue, and social credibility carrying the weight of the fantasy. And because the BBC approached the material so seriously, the audience is encouraged to accept the premise seriously as well. In many ways, the serial reveals something deeper about how the BBC believed serious drama should function, even when the subject was giant killer plants. That seriousness separates the production from many other science fiction dramas of the era. American genre television often leaned towards adventure, action, monsters, or technological spectacle. The BBC version of The Day of the Triffids feels far more interested in procedure and social organisation. Who can still communicate? Who can travel? Who can organise food? Who can build authority? Who can survive psychologically after systems collapse? In that sense, the production belongs to a broader tradition of serious British speculative television: Quatermass, Out of the Unknown, Survivors, and later Threads. These productions often treated science fiction less as escapism than as a way of examining institutions, social behaviour, fear, technology, and the fragility of ordinary life. And The Day of the Triffids fits squarely within that tradition. What remains especially effective now is the atmosphere. The serial understands how frightening ordinary spaces can become once normal systems fail. An empty London street, a hospital corridor lit too brightly, unanswered radio broadcasts, blind crowds moving uncertainly through familiar environments while something dangerous rustles somewhere nearby. The horror emerges not from constant attack, but from recognisable reality becoming unstable. And because the production remains grounded in everyday behaviour, viewers can imagine themselves inside the situation remarkably easily. That realism also explains why the Triffids themselves work more effectively than modern audiences sometimes expect. Technically, the creatures are limited by the practical effects capabilities of early 1980s British television, but the production wisely avoids relying entirely on spectacle. The Triffids often function more as looming presences than constantly visible monsters. Suggestion, sound, movement, and atmosphere become more important than detailed visual realism. Again, the BBC turns limitation into advantage. The audience's imagination helps complete the illusion, and beneath all the science fiction elements lies something very characteristic of British television drama during this period: faith in the audience's patience and concentration. The serial unfolds slowly. Characters spend time talking, travelling, listening, arguing, and attempting to understand events. Scenes are allowed to breathe. Modern genre television often fears stillness. The Day of the Triffids frequently depends upon it. And perhaps that is why the production still feels distinctive now. Not because every effect remains convincing, and not because the serial escapes the visible limitations of its era, but because the BBC approached science fiction with seriousness, restraint, and dramatic credibility. The production trusted atmosphere more than spectacle, performance more than effects, and social realism more than fantasy excess. In the process, the BBC helped create a very particular kind of British science fiction, quietly intelligent, slightly unsettling, and grounded firmly in the ordinary world. And decades later, that approach remains far more powerful than the idea of giant killer plants probably ought to be. So thanks very much for listening. I always appreciate that. I will be back on another day with another television show. Bye.